It's really good to be here, and I had a wonderful time with a few of you today. I'll remember it for a long time. I've been retired for a few years, and I must tell you, oh, I would rather be in a classroom. But it's fun to be here too. Um, so 238 years ago, the framers got together to sign the Constitution. Some of its principles, of course, are older than that, quite a bit older than that. I'm going to start with a story. I made it up. It's called Plato and the President. Here it goes. Hope with this story can illustrate some of those principles that may have been important for the writing of the Constitution. So it goes something like this. Plato walks into a bar. It's got to have a story like that. Plato walks into a bar. He sits down at the bar and he orders a glass of Retsina. Of course, he's Jewish. I mean, Jewish. He's Greek, so he's got to have Retsina. And he's waiting for the wine to come. And he looks to his left. He sees somebody he thinks he recognizes. So he scoots down the bar, and he starts up a conversation. He says, "Yasos, hi." Yasos being Greek. "Yasos, hi. Am I right that you're the President Trump? Hi, I'm Plato from Athens. I wrote the Republic and the laws and blank stare. Blank stare. All the while, on the screen behind the bar, you see the TV news going, right? Broadcast news. So more National Guard troops arrive in Los Angeles to support the local police who are responding to protesters against ICE. The administration says it's going to do the same in Chicago and Baltimore and New York and maybe other crime-ridden blue cities. Attorney General Bondi is throwing the book at the protester who threw a sandwich at a federal officer. A reporter reminded the viewers that earlier in the spring, the administration had defied court orders in deporting certain immigrants. And then Stephen Vladek from Georgetown Law School appears on the screen, and he says, these last few months have seen, quote, a truly unprecedented amount of lawlessness by this executive branch, close quote. Plato's companion looks on again, apparently bored. So Plato says, Donald, if I may, Donald, this seems pretty troubling, doesn't it? I once wrote a book and I said, the Apollos is Theos Makarios only. Wait a minute. What's this gibberish, he says. What's this gibberish? Oh, I'm sorry, says Plato. I was speaking in my native language. What I was saying is that a nation that's blessed by the gods, that's kind of odd, isn't it? Like if Apollos, a nation that's blessed by the gods, that means they're well ordered and peaceful and their well-being is secured and they're basically decent. Let's call it happy, okay? So a nation that's happy, I wrote, is one where the law is master over rulers, and rulers are servants. Actually, the Greek we use said slaves of the law. My student Aristotle wrote one time, he said, law must rule everything. Law must be sovereign. A happy nation is a normocracy. A normocracy, right? Trump. Wow, that's pretty heavy. But it doesn't touch me. Because, as I said in my recent cabinet meeting, which of course you saw, anyone saw the cabinet meeting, what I said there was, the Constitution gives me a right to do anything I want. I'm the president of the United States. If I think the country is in danger, then I'll do what I need to do, whatever I judge it to be. No, wise guy like you, Plato, would have learned about this guy called Louis the 14th. Oh, he was a great guy. He was a king. He was a monarch in France some years ago. What a great guy, and a beautiful palace, right? And so what this guy said was, "L'état c'est moi." No, I don't speak English. I mean, the problem with the French is that they don't know English, right? That they just don't know. But I've been told that what l'état c'est moi means, I am the state. What a great thought. But I want to change it a little bit. One of my friends told me that law, the English word, in French means loi. So I think what he should have said was, la loi, c'est moi. I'm the law. That's what I really like. That sounds good. I'll put that in gold on my Resolute desk, I think. That's what I'm going to do. So whatever I do can't be lawless because I did it. Because I get to say what's legal and not legal. That's why the sandwich thrower gets thrown in jail. But whatever I want to do, whenever I want to send troops to Los Angeles or level tariffs on nations around the world or demand billions of dollars from Harvard or send criminal immigrants to countries that they can't spell or kill people on the high seas, I can do that. Now, on the other side of the president is a very old, sort of toga-looking character, toga-wearing character, and he was obviously listening in on the conversation. So Plato says, "Hey, Aeschylus," my friend Aeschylus, Donald, this my friend's Aeschylus. What do you think of what Donald had to say there? And Aeschylus says, "Well, it sounded a whole lot like what I said some years ago about tyrannoi. I'm sorry, dictators. Tyrannoi, I said, were those who rule alone and send their deeds to no one's audit." Plato said, "You mean that if the law rules the ruler's not the last word on what's legal and non-legal?" Aeschylus said, "Yeah, that's just right. The Constitution not only gives various rights, but it also constrains power, establishing mechanisms of accountability for people to hold those who exercise power to that so that those actions conform to law." So Plato says, "So Donald, my friend is right. That means that the law, especially in this country, the Constitution, is not up to you. It's not optional for you. Moreover, the Constitution, if it's to do its assigned mastering work, the Constitution is also not optional for those who are charged with holding you accountable to the law." At this point, the president blows up, gets very agitated, his face gets very red, and he said, but that's nonsense. He explodes. "Do you mean to say that the law, those shadowy deep state actors, can stand in the way of what I want to do? What the American people elected me to do? Nonsense, I say," he says. "The Constitution gave me unlimited executive power. I can't even be prosecuted for committing a crime as long as I can tell them that I did it in the exercise of my constitutional powers." The Supreme Court said this. Yeah, I know. I don't always believe them, but they're right on this one. And he's really upset. And we better leave at that point the story. We don't know what's going to happen after that, okay? So that's the end of my little story. Well, we're left with some questions. A number of questions. The Constitution seems to make very large claims for itself. But really, what is the Constitution? Our Constitution? And how can it demand such allegiance? I want to answer these questions very briefly. We'll go into detail. But the U.S. Constitution, I believe, mind you, I'm not talking as Plato or Trump and Maurice was. I'm talking about myself now, right? From my own point of view. The U.S. Constitution is the indispensable scaffolding of our democracy, the essential normative structure of our public life, and the key technology that protects us against the arbitrary exercise of ruling power. It's not perfect, but it's ours, and we can work to make it better. However, the Constitution and its core institutions and norms can only rule when two conditions are met. One, those who are authorized to govern according to its terms are deeply committed to respecting the letter and the spirit of that Constitution. And secondly, all members of the polity, I'm trying to catch you folks over there, right? All members of the polity, public officials, ordinary citizens, and the like, accept the weighty responsibility of actively holding those who exercise ruling power strictly to the Constitution's terms. These responsibilities are not optional. They constitute the core of our civic duty, the demanding content of what I'm going to call the ethos of fidelity. Let me unpack this a little bit, right? First, we think of the Constitution as that venerated document in the National Archives Museum. But of course, it's a lot more. For one thing, essential constitutional principles and many of the most important rules and procedures are articulated in judicial decisions that have been handed down and developed over a long period of time, 2.5 centuries almost. But it also includes informal norms developed in the practices of various branches of government over that period as well. Some of the most fundamental such principles, for example, the principle of judicial independence and the independence of other parts of the government, the Department of Judges, the Justice, the military, and the like. These are must be independent of from political influence of the White House. Those are part of our unwritten Constitution. Secondly, this Constitution is basic in two important respects. First is, it grounds and authorizes all other laws and offices of government. It is, by the terms of the Constitution itself, the supreme law of the land. It's basic in that sense. It articulates standards by which those laws and the actions of officials are ruled. Secondly, it demands priority over all matters of policy and even the popular will. That is, it subjects the pursuit of policies and matters of justice to procedures and conditions that must be respected, regardless of the importance and urgency of the policies, even when they're matters of the popular will. You might say the Constitution is the superego of the demos, superego of the people. So we may have legitimate worries, even despair, mind you, despair about the movement of our climate, about public health, about the economy, about immigration, about international relations. We might have worries, even despair about that. However, we must pursue remedial policies only in ways that respect the Constitution and the laws it authorizes. This demand transcends party politics. That's what the Constitution's basic character demands of us. Thirdly, the Constitution is not just code, it's also culture. This has two dimensions. First, the Constitution is not restricted to a document or even to a collection of informal rules. It is the order and structure of the public or common part of our political community. It is that which makes the political community stable and sustains it over time. Secondly, the Constitution should be thought of as a kind of ethos. I'm thinking here about Aristotle, who talked to the politeia. The Constitution was not just rules, it was an ethos of the people in the community. An ethos that must be widely practiced by members of the polity, a deep and individual and collective commitment to the values that it's supposed to. This Constitution articulates principles, and through conformity to those principles, we recognize each other as fellow members of our community. Finally, the Constitution, while it is in this respect very demanding, it is not morally ultimate. In the sense of being morally rock bottom, you can't go behind it. Rather, it serves, mind you, perhaps imperfectly. It serves deeper values, in particular, democracy and the rule of law. When critics attack the current administration as lawless, and executive orders as unconstitutional, or indifferent to and in contempt of the law, these allegations have the moral weight they carry because, and in virtue of an implicit appeal to the more foundational, the deeper principle of the rule of law. So, to understand the moral and practical force of the Constitution, we have to understand its relationship to the rule of law that it must serve. However, in our political climate, the notion of the rule is highly contested. It's captured by those who would like to hang on to the halo of the rule of law, but loosen itself from the bridle. Dante once wrote, Dante, the Italian poet from many, many, many centuries ago, wrote, "Justice is so lovely that it's loved even by its enemies." That's got to be true even more for the rule of law. So if we're going to understand this fundamental moral value, better pay attention to the rule of law. I mean, to understand the Constitution, we have to pay attention to this underlying moral value. And so I'm going to, oh, it's gone. I'm going to talk about the rule of law. Right? We finally got around to law's rule. Okay, the rule of law. And I've got a little bit of stuff on your handouts to help, because this is a bit more than you can handle it. Keep in your own head, unless you've read a paper or two of mine. Okay, to begin with, we need to get a sense of the distinctive features of the rule of law, of this ideal. Here's how I want to put it. The rule of law is a normatively demanding, institutionally realized moral ideal that is animated by people of integrity and courage. Let me try to spell those things out. 1, it's a moral ideal. That is, it's profoundly important, complex moral value or principle, however you want to call it, related to other moral values like democracy, justice, fairness, human rights. It's not, strictly speaking, itself morally rock bottom. Rather, it's rooted in yet even deeper moral values. I'll talk about that. And from these values, we gauge the weight and importance and the limits of the rule of law in its relationship to other important moral and political values. It's ideal. I don't mean idealistic in the sense of unrealistic, but rather it's a matter of morally demanding, costly principle. It offers a standard by which we measure our rulers, our rules, laws, constitution, and ultimately our political communities. When it's realized, even imperfectly, in any particular community, it is a significant achievement. It's institutionally realized. Here's what I mean. The rule of law makes its impact in our political communities through a range of complex formal and informal institutions that are designed to realize it. The material, cultural, political circumstances of those communities in which the rule of law principles are realized can shape the institutions. And with varying political, material, and social and cultural circumstances, what institutions will do the job best can vary as well. It's not a one-size-fits-all institutional framework. We have to pay attention to the circumstances of political communities in which they are to be realized. Finally, it's animated. Institutions are important, but institutions taken alone are impotent, incapable of doing their work. They can only do their rule of law serving work when people of integrity take responsibility for doing their jobs within those institutions. The rule of law depends utterly on people committed to the rule of law and its underlying values. Okay, so that's the kind of general shape of it. Let's get down even more to the heart of the rule of law. The core idea is this. Rule of law is not about rules. It's about ruling. It's not about disorderly behavior. It's about arbitrarily exercised power. So the organizing aim of the rule of law is to temper power, not to nullify it, but to constitute, channel, and constrain the exercise of power, not to dismantle or destroy it, but to discipline it. By power, I mean this, not ability to change something in the world, pick it up and drop it, but to make people do things they don't want to do. It's power over people. That's the concern. I'm not going to try it out and do, okay? If I don't have that power in. Arbitrary means, by that I mean, one, it's unilateral. It's by the whim of the power wielder. And it's unaccountable, meaning it's answerable to no one. We call these skills. One's deeds are brought to no one's audit, right? Okay. The means, so that's the aim. The means that the rule of law chooses is law. The rule of law engages law in the enterprise of disciplining power. So law is, rule of laws, if you will, technology. Okay? Mind you, the rule of law does not idealize law. The rule of law recognizes that law is capable of majesty, said this today in class, but also of monstrosity. Laws can go bad. We know that they do. In fact, law can be used against the rule of law. It's a key thing to keep in mind. As well as against democracy and justice and whatever else. Thus, law's technology must serve the core aim of the rule of law. By technology here, I have to be careful. We must be careful. Law is not a tool of ruling power. Law must rule over ruling power. It's not in service of that power, but it is sovereign over. Remember Plato, law must be master and the ruler slave to it. On law and on those who wield those laws to exercise their power, law rules only when law's rules and institutions and their incumbent officials serve the underlying aim of the rule of law. So you can put it in summary this way. when the rule of law is robust in a political community, it offers protection and recourse against the arbitrary exercise of power through the means, technology of the law. It's kind of, I want to put that on a billboard as we go out of Charleston. Actually, I have a sign that this is not part of my text, so I get time off here, right? Um, I for a No Kings March a couple of months ago, I have a sign that said, "Law must rule over arbitrary power." It was a quote from my book. I was trying to sell the book, right? And no one bought it. But the rule of law, if you take that aim and its means seriously, is still very abstract. And so we have to work out, sort of kneading the dough, work out its core principles. And I argue in that book that we can identify three important principles that do the job that law is supposed to do in serving that end. I call this sovereignty, quality of a kind, and fidelity. And because I'm a philosopher, I make lots of distinctions. So the first principle has three parts. So there are effectively 5 principles, but let's call it 3 with 3 subparts, okay? So the first is, that's on your paper so you can see it. First is sovereignty, the sovereignty of law, and that's the idea, expressed simply, is just law alone must rule over all modes of ruling power. This simple statement, of course, is just too simple because it buries some complexity. And I think the complexity could be expressed in 3 more principles, okay? Exclusivity, legality, and very importantly, reflexivity. All right, those 3. Exclusivity. This principle insists that the legitimate governing power derives exclusively from the law. There's no legitimate ruling power beyond that which is ordained by law. Now, being ordained by law may not be the only condition of legitimacy of ruling power, but it is legitimacy sine qua non. Legality. All governing power must be exercised through the law, and law must meet certain key standards of formal and procedural legality. So law rules only when law's rules and institutions serve the underlying aim of tempering ruling power. And they can only do that at a minimum when official actions conform to the requirements of formal and procedural legality, what we it's sort of in our political vernacular called due process. Okay. Reflexivity. According to this principle, law must govern everyone, especially those who govern with the law. Those who govern with the law must likewise be governed by the law. No one, regardless of social or political position, wealth, or office, escapes law's sovereign sway. I think reflexivity is the ultimate expression of law's sovereignty. It's the first and greatest commandment, if you will, of sovereignty. Let me make 3 further points about this. 1. According to this principle, while law must always authorize power, it must always accompany that authorization with guidelines and rules and standards to guide the exercise of that power. This is something I call the no black holes rule, where a black hole, a legal black hole, is power that's given to some agent with no guidelines. It's a legal black hole. You got the place, but nothing that directs it. No black holes. Secondly, the interpretation and the application of those norms is never solely up to those who exercise the power. Bentham liked to talk about ipse dixit. Y'all know your Latin, right? What's ipse dixit? Say dixit, ipse, self, because I say so. Bentham said, there should never be ipse dixit. So the no ipse dixit says no one who exercises power is in a position solely to determine whether the standards governing that exercise have been followed. Interpretation is not solely in the hands of those who exercise that power. No black holes, no ipse dixit. Finally, sovereign rule, law's sovereign rule, is needed most where the ruling power is the greatest. I call this the no escape dimension. No black holes, no ipse dixit, no escape. The demands of compliance with the law and its accountability to it apply to everyone in the political community. But these demands are far weightier upon those who wield ruling power. No escape. Okay, that's the simple principle, right? Let me get you next to equality. Now, in a sense, reflexivity already gives us a sense of equality. It's, it's sort of common parlance. No one's above the law, a kind of, everyone's subject to the law kind of idea. But the equality notion I have in mind here is different. It is the idea of equality in the eyes of the law. So the rule of law demands that all who are bound by the law must enjoy its protection and recourse on an equal basis. The law that binds must equally protect and empower those who are subject to ruling power. Empower them to participate in holding those who exercise ruling power accountable to the law. Upon its initial articulation, it does not entail material equality. It requires equality in the name of the law, in the eyes of the law, equality in the eyes of the law. We'll come to an implication of this later on, but at this point, it doesn't require that everyone be on the same basis, same economic basis, that everyone be just as rich as everyone else, or poor, for that matter. Fidelity. The rule of law includes not only formal and procedural and institutional standards, it also demands, and more than just compliance of everyone with the law, it also comprises, let me be careful about this, it comprises a set of relationships and responsibilities rooted in core convictions and commitments that are essential for the achievement of the rule of law. Fidelity requires this, that all members of the community take responsibility for holding each other, and especially law's officials, to account under the law. Law can be sovereign, only if a robust ethos of fidelity takes root in a political community. When law rules, government officials are held accountable for the discharge of their duties under the law, and ordinary citizens structure their relationships by law and hold each other accountable to their common public terms, the common public terms of law. Fidelity, I want to say, is the animating spirit of the rule of law. Fidelity makes demands on all members of the community, but it makes special demands on those who are empowered by position and profession or public recognition to take the lead in holding those who wield power accountable. I'm going to call these rule of law first responders. Okay. But the rule of law faces two problems right off the top. It makes costly demands on those who wield power and on those who have to hold them accountable to the law. These are costly demands. Furthermore, it seems fussy, like it makes a fetish, even an ideology, if you will, of rules and laws, procedures and processes, all shorn of any intrinsic substantive value that could grip the soul. So how do we answer these? We have to ask, by what right does the rule of law make these costly demands? And how can we avoid fetishism of laws? Wherein lies its moral force? It's not enough to say rule of law really loud and then play martial music to gin up a little bit of enthusiasm. I don't know. But why we should take it seriously? We have to look at its deeper value, the deeper value it's means to serve. So what I argue is that there is a deeper value, but it's a really complex one. I call it membership. Now, you never heard that value before because I made it up when I was writing this book. I just made it up. But some of the parts of it you probably have heard. Membership offers a vision of community, of a certain kind of community of people that are bound together by history, by interdependence, and maybe even by mutual regard. In a membership community, members are not subordinated to any other person or group. They are subject to each other, but reciprocally. That idea has several implications. Let me try to spell these out. First, a membership community is a fellowship of mutuality. It's an engagement of mutual commitments among members structured by a network of mutual responsibilities. These mutual responsibilities, in turn, structure the ways in which the members care for each other and for their community. Secondly, a membership community is characterized by a commitment to what I call peerhood. You might call it equality, but I call it peerhood. That is the conditions in which members can stand face to face with each other on a footing of equality. They have the same status. They can look each other in the eyes. Exactly. Very good. Third, membership community is open and inclusive. But it demands that the kind of inclusion respects diversity of those invited into the membership. It calls for inclusion of each in a community of peers. The peers are not, and they must never be compelled to be, the same. Rather, in their diversity, they occupy the same status. We say, of course, e pluribus unum, right? Out of many, one. That's not the membership. Forgive me for a musical analogy. It's e pluribus, out of many, fugum, a polyphonic fugue. Jonathan will get this, some of you won't. A fugue in which there are lots of different voices that somehow or other, they come in, they clash, they work around, but they are part of a single. Not a unit. There's no unison there. You don't seek unison, we seek fugal relationships. That's the kind of inclusion that membership requires. And finally, then, membership entails a kind of respect for dignity and freedom. The dignity that one has when one can stand and look eye to eye with others and have the same stats, the dignity that comes with not only its being the case that one can do that, but it's structured in its rules that that's true for all of us. There's public recognition of that. That's how our dignity as individuals is respected. And of course, then also a form of freedom, the freedom of being free from the arbitrary whim of others, whether it be someone in power or others. So freedom of non-domination, some people call it. So the notion of membership, then, as you can tell, is pretty complex. It's a complex combination of, under one normative roof, of community, equality, dignity, freedom. These are complementary, but mutually limiting components of this composite idea. My thought is, if you buy that combination, if you find that really compelling, then we've got a ground for rule of law's robust opposition to the subjection of anyone to the arbitrary exercise of power by someone else. That's the very evil that the rule of law is aimed against. However, the rule of law doesn't accomplish this all by itself. It does so in partnership with practices and institutions that serve other key values of political morality, especially democracy and various human rights. These values are distinct. They're different values from the rule of law, but they are in very complex ways interrelated. And in my view, the rule of law provides the necessary infrastructure for democracy. As I mentioned it today in our class, the rule of law provides if you can accept this construction, building metaphor, it's the rebar that gives strength to the concrete, gives it tensile strength so that it can actually shift with the prevailing winds without collapsing. Okay, the rule of law is institutionally realized idea. Ooh, good one. Law disciplines power by tethering the exercise of public norms enforced by codified mechanisms of mutual accountability. These institutional mechanisms are only as strong as the ethos of fidelity that animates them. But familiar constitutional institutions of government, like a network of checks and balances, as we learned in our high school civics, are key translations and adaptations of the rule of law principles to particular circumstances of our political community. In general, the rule of law makes the following kinds of institutional demands. First, rule of law must be channeled always through law. A ruling power must always be channeled through law. And laws, legal institutions, procedures must conform to conditions of legality. Consistency, intelligibility, fair notice, due process, universal access to justice, and that sort of thing. Yes, Finn. Fuller's 8 canons, right? Okay? Secondly, the rule of law requires that there be governmental institutions that constitute and constrain and sanction the exercise of ruling power through mechanisms of accountability. And there are two kinds, or two levels. I want to distinguish between horizontal accountability and vertical accountability. Networks of network of mechanisms of horizontal accountability include separation of basic governing powers, each checking and balancing the others within government, right? And structures within each division, part of government, that discipline the powers that are thus distributed. So the departments of government must be independent of each other, but also in important ways check each other. Occupants are first responders. Especially important examples of this would be guarantee of independence of the judiciary, of the military, of the Department of Justice, intradepartmental institutions like inspectors general and ethics offices and ombudsman's offices and that kind of thing. We're talking about a complex network in which there are carefully balanced checks and balances against the exercise with respect to the exercise of power, disciplining that power. The rule of law also heavily relies on mechanisms of vertical responsibility, where by vertical I mean responsibility, accountability that's actuated by those in civil society, holding those in governmental positions accountable to the law. Critical components of this are extra governmental organizations and practices that are rooted in civil society and populated by ordinary citizens who don't hold public office. Most important of these, free press, free media, universities, NGOs of many kinds, professional associations, labor unions, other things like that. Civil society organizations that are set up to educate individual citizens, encourage them, mobilize them, coordinate them, and discipline them in their fidelity responsibilities. Finally, the rule of law, very importantly, depends on a robust legal profession that undertakes and is deeply committed to the rule of law. Lawyers and judges are the conservators of the law, guardians of its integrity. They are key operatives in both the horizontal, and this is horizontal and in vertical accountability. Now, these mechanisms of horizontal and vertical accountability form, roughly speaking now, we have to make some adjustments of this perhaps, but roughly speaking, a pyramid. At the apex are courts, not just SCOTUS, not just the Supreme Court, but the courts, populated by lawyers and judges bound to the Constitution and the rule of law. At a level just below them, you can imagine in our pyramid, are elected officials, officers in governmental departments and the like. I mean those people who are elected to legislative positions, but also those who are in various ways incumbents in in governmental offices. Responsible for holding others accountable. That's their job. An important job, rule of law job. Beneath this is a level of ordinary citizens. I take it that's most of us. I call them auxiliaries. The first responders, I call them auxiliaries, right? Who are organized, disciplined, coordinated by complex network of institutions and associations in civil society. They back up, hold accountable, support, reinforce first responders, and often audit more directly the actions of power wielders themselves. So we might call this a pyramid of accountability, but we also could call it a pyramid of fidelity. Because at every level, institutions and structures and organizations can do their job only if incumbents are motivated by fidelity. Fidelity is the animating spirit of all these institutions. Moreover, and I'm going to make a big point of this in a little bit, this model makes clear that the point that the essential discipline of the rule of law is a whole community enterprise. Threats, perils. The rule of law can be robust in a political community, but it is vulnerable to threats of many kinds. Let me take a brief look. First, keep this in mind. The rule of law is not in a deep way threatened by violations. It's threatened in a deep way by impunity. That is, violations pose genuine threats to the rule of law only when the accountability response of officials and of the broader community are compromised, meek, or mute. And that's because the rule of law constitutes a kind of homeostatic system. So violations of the law disturb the equilibrium, but if there are forces to bring that equilibrium back, like accountability, equilibrium can be restored, and we've got maybe even a stronger equilibrium than we had before. If the accountability response is, as I said, compromised or mute, disequilibrium rules. It's a homeostatic system, but it's not a perfect one. At each level, the institution, structures, and organizations can function effectively and do their work only if all persons, officials, quasi-officials, and so on do their jobs. See, the Chief Justice or a justice of the Indian Supreme Court, called H.R. Khanna, once said this: 3 marks of decay of the rule of law are a docile bar, a subservient judiciary, and a choked and coarsened conscience. I think that's deeply, profoundly accurate and suggestive. He recognizes the role of first responders, right? In addition, he calls attention to the key role that the community as a whole plays. The conscience he has in mind is not just the conscience of the first responders, it's the conscience of the rest of us. Furthermore, Khanna's comment, I'm building on this, suggests that the rule of law may face a deeper source of peril: decay of the moral climate of a political community. Now, the moral climate of a community functions like a kind of commons, in the old English sense, where everyone puts their cows on the commons and it doesn't belong to anyone, but you make use of it. You contribute to it, you take from it. People add to, they sustain or weaken the common through their interactions and their practices and their engagements with other members of the community. The consciences and commitments of individuals live and breathe in the moral environment of their political community. When toxins invade that moral environment from without or breed within it, they can choke and coarsen the consciences of those who draw on it. I want to distinguish 2 sources or kinds of such threats. I call it acute, it's on the list, and chronic. By acute threats, I mean manifest or subtle violations of law or breaches of the rule of law that meet with compromised or mute or meek responses. Chronic threats are forms of decay of this underlying moral community. Let me just talk briefly about a couple examples of each of those. One, first, acute. I'll give, say, 3 examples, broad examples. First, acute threats might include explicitly violating existing law, constitutional principles, norms, the due process, independence of key institutions, statutory rules, norms of international law, but also attempts to rewrite constitutional norms by decree, especially when it's done in such a volume and speed that the existing system is stretched perhaps beyond its capacity to respond, often taken under a thin veil of legal argument, sometimes by appeals to national emergency. Secondly, efforts that circumvent or weaken or compromise the constitutional or legally established frameworks of controlling power, dismantling, if you will, or eviscerating sources of opposition, depriving them of funding, access to information, legal protection. Some examples: attacks on inspectors general, firing a whole lot of them, or ombudsman's office, attacks on powerful civil society institutions, manipulating law firms, universities, NGOs. Thirdly, efforts directed against individuals attempting to enlist and co-opt and corrupt officials or other first responders and their firms, to eliminate or neutralize their capacity to check the exercise of governing power. These efforts may involve intimidation, harassment, arrest, on vague pretexts. You've read a lot about this. Chronic, just a couple of examples. Corruption of public discourse. Citizens, where this happens, citizens lack a common language in which they can express their views, as different or conflicting as they may be. The public language is corrupted and abused, turned upside down. I don't know if you feel this way, but if you read the news at all, you don't know where things are. The language is just going all over the place. It doesn't have any way to settle. Key concepts and values that they stand for are abused, captured for partisan purposes, encouraging us to abandon our commitment to the possibility of achieving common understanding of our world. Exacerbating this, increases in disinformation by our media. Second, to follow Khanna's language, choked public conscience. People inadequately understand and fail to appreciate the important public values of the Constitution, but especially the rule of law and those deeper values we talked about. Those values on which democracy and the rule of law rest. People see them as fussy obstacles to doing what they want to do. At one point, I want to say their horizon of moral concern is narrowed to me and mine. I find it difficult to see anything that would be a claim on them that is a claim beyond what is not serving my selfish purposes, but those who are close. A spirit of apathy then and cynicism, along with the narrowed horizon of moral concern, deeply undercut the ethos of fidelity because it depends so much on the recognition of common values and the need for common concerted effort to serve them. Finally, coarsened public conscience. There's some talk recently of what we might call the toxin of disinhibition. Have you heard that? That's the thought that through various activities, usually of our public officials, what happens that people get the view that, all those rules I've had to follow since I was a kid at my mother's knee, I don't have to follow them. They don't follow them. Why should I? We get a culture of disinhibition, the kind of things that can constrain us from acting in ways that treat people decently. So on. That's a kind of coarsened public conscience. And with this, it becomes easy to justify, even to celebrate, political violence. And so a kind of brutalization of the community is possible. That is a deep threat to the rule of law. Finally, let me talk about, I also mentioned something about ongoing deep distrust of institutions. I'm going to move on to talk about one further kind of, why this apathy? Why this distrust? It's rooted sometimes in alienation. The kind of threats might have a variety of sources, but amongst them might be activities of power wielders themselves, or failures of the law, or failures of background social and economic conditions. So that, the rule of law promises the powerless to protect the powerless, and empower them, and to bridle the powerful who wield power against them. But when ordinary citizens in these circumstances, lack resources to make themselves heard, or mobilize the law to provide its promised protection and recourse, the law appears to them as nothing more than other people's power. Law is like a door in a meadow. You can walk through it, but why? If we get to that point, the rule of law in the underlying moral climate has been deeply undermined. So let me come to a conclusion. There is an ancient prophet. You probably heard his name. Isaiah. Writing in the 8th century BCE. He wrote an indictment of his community that is agonizingly accurate for ours. It goes like something like this. Judgment is turned back, and integrity stands at a distance. Truth stumbles in the public square, and right has no place. Whoever turns from evil makes himself a prey. Not a P-R-A-Y. A prey. So when the Supreme Court, and especially this Chief Justice, choose understandings of the Constitution that enhance in unprecedented way executive power, rather than temper it, rather than discipline. When lawyers pursue legal or constitutional arguments that fail the test of constitutional service to the rule of law, when DOJ and White House lawyers choose loyalty to the president over loyalty to the Constitution, when members of one party or another choose power over principle, when ordinary citizens remain silent about or even encourage infractions of the constitutional principles or norms of simple decency, and explain away or blame political opposition for increasing political science. When I say these things occur in a political community, and they occur in our political community, we can reasonably wonder whether the rule of law has failed, that authoritarianism has arrived. However, I want to insist that even at this point, we must not ask, is the rule of law failing? But are we failing the rule of law? That's the question we should ask. It's not just when everyone agrees that surely the rule of law is failing, but every day. In response to violations of the law, of the rule of law, we must not wait for the authoritative judgment of historians and political scientists. Claire? We have to demand now, when we see there are infractions, that we call them out. Holding ruling power accountable is our civic duty, responsibility. It's a collective one, but it's distributed amongst all of us. We must demand that those who wield power do so scrupulously, according to the laws that constitute our democracy and govern our international relations. So we must condemn, in the name of the rule of law and its underlying values, illegal and unconstitutional, anti-constitutional actions of power wielders, especially those that fall most heavily, I want to underline this, those actions that fall most heavily on those who are most vulnerable. Someone put it, those who are at the point of the whip. We have to call out and unequivocally condemn political violence in all its forms, whoever commits it, and whatever its target. The rule of law, I want to stress, the rule of law is no guarantee of justice or democracy or respect for human rights. However, democracy, justice, respect for human rights simply are not possible and the absence of robust rule of law. Moreover, the rule of law and the Constitution that, mind you, imperfectly serves it, makes a powerful claim on our allegiance in the name of dignity, peerhood, and the liberty of each as co-members in our polity. We can engage in this activity with hope. Václav Havel, the poet and Czech Republic leader, was he not? Once wrote this: hope is the ability to work for something important, not because our efforts are likely to succeed, but because it's good. I would like to just massage that a bit. So I would say, not just because it's likely to succeed, but because it's not merely good in the sense of optional, but good in the sense that it's right and compelling. This responsibility is not optional. Thanks.